Hello, my name is Marie Lamenche. I'm a researcher at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're here with Ambassador Frederic C, who is now at the Hariri Center. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
And then you were formerly working with the Obama administration.
That's correct. I worked in Syria with the Obama administration from April 2009 until November 2012.
Okay. Well, the reason why we wanted to interview you is because, well, you have worked with the Obama administration, and the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Studies is obviously based in Canada, and we're trying to look at what the U.S. is kind of doing, and the U.S. foreign policy in terms of Syria and Iraq, and trying to understand what the Obama administration has been doing over the past 5 years. And you wrote an article in Foreign Policy, and about the Obama administration and what kind of foreign policy it has towards Syria. And so we'd like to know, is it just rhetoric? We've had a lot of talks about red lines, for example, from President Obama, but we don't see substantive action. Would you agree with that? We'd just like to know a little bit more about what you think about U.S. Foreign policy towards Syria in terms of diplomacy, humanitarian affairs, technological assistance.
Sure. I must say, from my point of view, my personal concern about Syria is not whether or not the Obama administration agrees with specific steps that I would recommend. To me, that's not important. I think there are two things that are important. First of all, my sense is that the administration has never really put together a strategy aimed at implementing what the president said in August 2011, namely that Bashar al-Assad should step aside. The president had a very good reason for making that statement. He could see that Bashar al-Assad had launched a very vigorous program of collective punishment and mass murder. And the second thing that I think is important for the United States around the world, not just in Syria, not just in the Middle East, is that there should never be the perception of a gap between presidential words and presidential actions. And I think this has been the real deficit in American policy towards Syria, and I'm afraid it's had implications around the world.
Yeah, and how much do you think does it coincide with a change in U.S. foreign policy under the Obama administration?
Well, I think the president came to office believing that he had a mandate to end American participation in armed conflicts in the Middle East, and to try to the extent he could to focus away from the Middle East, particularly in the direction of East Asia. So I think that's been a very high priority. But sometimes inconvenient facts have a way of getting in the way of things. I'm sure that when Harry Truman, way back when, entered into his first full term as President of the United States, a war in Korea was not part of his agenda. That's certainly not where he meant to go. And President Obama, whether he likes it or not, has been faced with a humanitarian abomination in Syria and a foreign policy disaster.
Well, here's at the Institute, we kind of adopt a national interest approach, trying to push leaders and policymakers to take action in conflicts, even though, in Rwanda, for example, it was a small country at the time. We didn't think that it would have any impact on all lives here. And in Syria, we see today, maybe at the, when it first started, we thought, oh, maybe we have no interest in Syria. There is nothing there. We shouldn't take strong action. But now we see what's happening in Europe and all the refugees. Do you think the U.S. never really saw that they had any interest in doing anything for Syria? And do you think they obviously regret it now?
I think Obama has always demonstrated an interest in trying to address many of the humanitarian consequences of what's happened in Syria. I think the American taxpayer, thanks to the leadership of the White House and the action of Congress, has been pretty generous in terms of humanitarian assistance for refugees and the like. At the policy level, the problem of Syria has always been pretty straightforward. What happens in Syria doesn't stay in Syria. Okay, so even if people are not moved by the sheer scope of murder and terror and displacement and all of that, even if people's feelings about mass murder are not very strong, the policy implications of Syria's agony spilling out over its neighbors, spilling all the way up into Western Europe, affecting the politics of Western Europe, the EU and NATO allies of the United States. This has been an extraordinary development, and I must say it's an unintended consequence.
If you were still working for the Obama administration for the U.S. government in general, what kind of recommendations would you give them now?
Well, I'll tell you, working for the Atlantic Council, which is a Washington-based independent think tank, our mission here is to try to provide practical recommendations as if we're still serving in government. And my recommendation consistently has been for the United States to formulate a strategy that would focus on two aspects of Syria. In Western Syria, where the Assad regime still exists, I think civilian protection is absolutely essential. Protecting Syrian civilians is the mandatory portal one must go through to get to any kind of a political resolution of that war. So in Western Syria, civilian protection. In Eastern Syria, finishing off ISIS, the Islamic State, Daesh, as quickly as possible. Ideally, by configuring a ground combat force consisting largely of regional forces, European forces, and some American forces under American leadership. That's been the missing piece of the puzzle so far.
Mm-hmm. Continuing on ISIS, do you think we pay perhaps a little bit too much on attention to ISIS compared to Assad, considering he is actually at the root of the conflict in a way, and the Assad regime commits more crimes against humanity, against civilians than ISIS?
My suspicion is that we don't pay enough attention to either side of this equation. I certainly support the action of the United States Congress and now the statement of Secretary of State John Kerry, pointing out that ISIS has been involved in genocidal activities. There's no doubt about that. This announcement, this designation is certainly merited. Nevertheless, we have the objective fact that the number of people actually killed by ISIS is a small fraction of the number of innocent civilians killed as a result of Assad regime collective punishment and mass homicide tactics, which may not meet, probably in most cases don't meet, the strict definition of genocide. But genocide is a subset of mass murder. And there is no doubt that the Assad regime has conducted mass murder on a massive scale.
Mm-hmm. No, we welcome the statement yesterday of John Kerry, and we truly hope that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will do the same. And actually, my colleagues and I are really working on, op-eds and calls to the government to actually do something and follow suit, because we've always believed that naming the crime is absolutely essential, and we certainly welcome the statement of the House and John Kerry's statement yesterday. Whether it will really change something or not, we will see. But for eventual prosecution as well, I think this is important. Is that your point of view as well?
Yes, yes, and if I can make one absolutely unsolicited suggestion, it would be that you urge Prime Minister Trudeau in whatever statement he makes about ISIS genocide to include mention of the mass murder that's taking place in the other part of Syria. This was noticeably lacking from Secretary of State Kerry's statement, and I fear the impact that may have on Syrians who for 5 years now have been on the receiving end of Assad's atrocities. I mean, the unintended implication is that your suffering does not count because it may not rise to the level of genocide in terms of definition. And this is an unintentionally but still cruel impression to convey to people.
I fully agree. I mean, obviously, we have a lot of Syrian refugees in Canada, and I've spoken to many of them, and most of them actually resent the Assad regime much more than ISIS led in the first place. And they, a lot of them. I mean, the reason I asked the question about do we pay too much attention to ISIS is because that's what I hear from a lot of Syrian refugees here. They all believe Assad is the most important problem right now.
Yes, and in the Syrian context, it probably is the most important problem. I think as North Americans, what we and our political leaders have to take into account is the possibility of ISIS based in Raqqa in Syria being able to conduct in Toronto or Miami or Ottawa or San Francisco, an operation roughly analogous to the operation it conducted in Paris last November 13th. So I think from a North American perspective, this helps to account for some of the sense of urgency, some of the emphasis on ISIS. As bad as Assad is, and as guilty as I presume he is, of war crimes and crimes against humanity on a mass scale, his crimes, to the best of my knowledge, do not include the planning or execution of massive terror incidents in Europe or North America.
Mm-hmm. Now, you're Middle East expert, so I'd like to have your point of view on the role of the Gulf countries in this conflict, because it can seem rather confusing, especially when it comes to Iran and Saudi Arabia. Perhaps you could comment a little bit on what they're doing and what they should do.
Yes, in some respects, the Syrian crisis has become something of a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. From Iran's point of view, Bashar al-Assad is very important, very, very, very important in what the Iranians would define as their national security priorities. The Iranians have come to the conclusion that Bashar al-Assad is absolutely and personally essential to their ability to use a significant part of Syria as a secure hinterland for their militia in Lebanon, namely Hezbollah. The Iranians have come to the, I think, to the analytical conclusion, and I have to agree with them on this, that in Syria, beyond Assad, beyond his family, beyond his regime, there is really no constituency for subordinating the country to Iran on the issue of Hezbollah. So this is why the Iranians have made such an expensive investment in saving Bashar al-Assad from military defeat. I think from the point of view of the Saudis and the Arab Gulfies in general, this is a matter of trying to defeat an Iranian attempt at imposing and extending hegemony in the Arab world. And I think that particularly private sources in the Arab Gulf, particularly over the years, Kuwaiti private donors have unfortunately pumped resources into Syria that have supported strongly sectarian alternatives to Bashar al-Assad. In my view, this is a horrific mistake. In my view, this is something that is actually welcomed by the Assad regime. And in my view, these donors could have saved a lot of time and effort just by sending the money directly to Bashar, because that's been the effect of their support for sectarian actors.
Also, this week we've been in a way surprised by the role of Russia. Russia suddenly decided to move out. Could you comment on, what in your perspective, what did Russia want all along? What is it doing? Is it, in Syria? What does it want from Assad, for example?
I think what Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, wants in particular is to defeat what he labels in front of domestic audiences, indeed in front of the United Nations General Assembly, a sort of regime change and democratization campaign by the West, led by the United States, in the Middle East, North Africa region. Putin, I believe, has chosen Syria as the ideal battleground where he can defeat this regime change campaign.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's a nonsensical accusation. This is about the last thing in the world Barack Obama is interested in.
Mm-hmm.
But for Putin, there are sound domestic political reasons in this manner. And I think his military intervention that began last September 15th was aimed at saving Assad militarily and ultimately boosting Assad's prospects of surviving a negotiating process by creating military facts on the ground. Unfortunately, here in the 21st century, the basic rules of diplomacy have not been repealed. Diplomatic results, more often than not, if not always, reflect military facts. He has created military facts. Now, the withdrawal from Syria is far from total. He still has very impressive combat capability inside Syria, but it may be that Vladimir Putin decided, I've essentially achieved my objectives, and if I continue at the same pace, I'm going to start hitting the law of diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's taking a pause right now, and I think he wants Assad's negotiators to engage in the process and draw it out, because Vladimir Putin's definition of victory here would be the United States and the West eventually deciding, however reluctantly, to go into partnership with Bashar al-Assad against ISIS.
Yeah.
Putin would be able to tell his constituents, I have defeated this regime change campaign. I have put Russia back at the center of the world stage, and Russia is calling the shots. I think that's his ultimate objective.
Well, the last two questions that I'd like to ask are more related to the refugee crisis. I myself, I'm European. I'm from Belgium, but I lived in France, so I can see, I look at the situation quite closely. And here in Canada, we have, over the past few months, welcomed quite a lot of refugees. Now, I'd like you to comment perhaps on the current kind of debates in Europe on the EU-Turkey agreement, and do you think that all the refugees who are trying to enter Europe back to Turkey, and or what can Europe do? Because obviously, looking at Greece, for example, you know, Greece is really struggling, and so is Lebanon and Jordan. So what can Europe do? Do you think?
Yeah, it reminds me that about 2.5 years ago, I had lunch in Washington with a very prominent European diplomat, European official, who happened basically to share my views about Syria. But he made the comment at one point. He said, "Fred, there's one thing you have to understand about the prevailing Western European attitude towards Syria, and that is that Western Europeans don't give a damn about Syria as long as the problem stops in Turkey." And sadly, I think that's been pretty well borne out. Europe really began to pay attention to the problem of Syria when it found itself awash with migrants, a relatively high percentage of which were Syrian. So now this is obviously roiling the waters politically in Europe in very violent and potentially unpredictable ways. I think it is not very likely that large numbers of refugees will be returned to Turkey. I think it's a very, very difficult problem for the European Union to sort out. But my own sense is that Chancellor Merkel had it essentially correct from the beginning. And that is, in the case of Germany anyway, facing a large labor deficit, having people who exhibited high literacy, high skill rates, and the initiative to leave Syria to take a very risky journey by boat to Greece, and then walk all the way to places like Munich and Berlin, that these people in the fullness of time would become excellent Germans. I think she's probably right about that.
My German colleague here and myself, who I've lived, I think we would agree with you there. And I mean, one of the problems that I see now is that refugees are, especially in Europe, are really seen as a problem, even though they're fleeing conflict. And my last question would be more towards, perhaps more personal in a way. We're looking at the elections right now in the US and all wondering who this Mr. Trump person is, and why there is so much anger in the US, and why the US also has welcomed only 121 refugees. We've settled only 121 compared to what's happening in Europe and here in Canada, where more refugees. Do you think that has to do with a lot with the state of politics right now in the US, or the electorate? Do you think Americans are fearful of Syrian and Iraqi refugees?
I think that Americans, see what happened in Paris, when they see what's happening in Syria. I think there is a great deal of concern that is understandable,
Mm-hmm.
understandable about the security ramifications of permitting large numbers of refugees to come in the United States. On the other hand, steps taken by the American to vet people coming to the United States are comprehensive. I think there's something on the order of 12 to 14 discrete steps involved in these investigations, and I think there is a high probability that refugees coming to the United States will not present any significant problems. And like most refugees, like virtually all refugees who have come from Syria over the last century and a half to the United States, they will adapt very, very quickly to life here, and they will provide a lot more ultimately to the United States than they will extract. I think it's very regrettable that this refugee crisis, that the crisis in Syria, that the refugee problem this crisis is causing is being processed and articulated in very negative terms in some quarters in this political campaign. I think it's very exploitive. It's very unfair, and my sense is that almost anybody who becomes president of the United States, when faced with the facts, is probably going to have to dispose of a lot of the rhetoric employed in political campaigns. I hope so, anyway.
Yeah, me too. Because since Prime Minister Trudeau came in government, we've welcomed more refugees. We see this that they kind of change the atmosphere and the a point of, or idea of refugees. There's a lot being done at the private level to help them and to open jobs and to provide lessons in English and French and to try and help them. And it's something good to see in the country, and it kind of brings a lot of optimism. And Mr. Trudeau's visit last week to Washington was really quite something grand that seen from here at least. So I hope that the U.S. will follow as well.
Well, there is a strong and enduring vein of great generosity in the American public, and regardless of how politicians try to exploit this issue to build fears and get votes. I suspect that Syrian refugees coming to the United States will be welcomed, and will find among their American neighbors many people willing to reach out to them and help. This has been our history. It is a proud history, and I really don't expect to see that turned around.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for taking part in this interview. Thank you very much.
It's been my great pleasure. Take care.
Take care.